have with us on our briefing on the human rights situation in Syria. We have two witnesses who are coming to us by video conference. From Simcoe, Ontario, we have Anas Al-Qasim. He is a Syrian-Canadian doctor who managed a medical team on the ground in Aleppo. He is co-founder of the Union of Medical Care and Relief Organizations and chair of the Union of Syrian Relief Organizations Canada. We also have by video conference from Surrey, England, Miles Windsor, who is Advocacy and Development Manager at Middle East Concern, a collective of Christian organizations that monitors persecution and discrimination against Christians in the Middle East and North Africa. So welcome to the committee, and we will begin with Mr. Al-Qasim for 10 minutes, and then we'll go to questions after the two witnesses. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me. Thank you for the subcommittee on the international human rights today for this opportunity again to witness for what's going on in Syria. And I would like to thank the MP Ikra Khalid particularly for the invitation. I will just give a summary about the situation, the humanitarian situation on the ground in the last month since the operation started by the Syrian regime and the allies, particularly the Russian air forces on April 28th, 2019. The military escalation targeting many villages and towns in northern Hama, in southern Idlib, has caused a big influx of internal displaced people, reaching about 425,000 refugees trying to reach to the Turkish border and spreading all over the northern villages and camps. The continuity of displacement and a huge number of internal displaced people have caused a state of instability for the humanitarian situation, particularly for organizations like ours, the Union of Medical Care and Relief, and other humanitarian organizations due to the incapability of dealing with these influxes of refugees and displaced people and the lack of medical supplies, medical aids, and shelters. I've been to Syria on several medical missions before, including Aleppo, and we helped the medical crews on the ground, and we helped to set up the largest hospital, Bab al-Hawa, at the border. But I'm more concerned at the current time, as I feel the Syrian regime and the allies, including Russian allies, are using the policy of burned land with the intensified operations, shelling the towns and the villages over large area, not only one city, like the example of Aleppo and Damascus suburb. And the concern is that many of the people living in these villages already they have been displaced from other areas in southern Damascus, Idlib, and Aleppo. Unfortunately, in the last month or so, 24 medical facilities were targeted, and there was suspension of 40 other facilities due to the fears of being targeted as well. We lost 12 victims of medical aid and humanitarian workers in the last month. And unfortunately, just last week, 4 family members of one of our mobile clinic driver has died. It is really terrifying to see the pictures of his kids being burned, including 2 twin girls and a boy who's 8 years old. I'm sure some of you have seen the horrifying picture of a young boy killed with phosphorus gas, being burned completely, which is even forbidden by the international law. In the last month, there was about 400 civilians died, and we documented that more than 50% they have been women and children, including more than 165 children, just to tell you about the discriminating nature of the air forces being used against civilians. I'd like to take this opportunity to ask the Canadian government to deploy extra funds to help the medical relief workers on the ground, the humanitarian workers, since we have severe shortage of medical supplies. Northern hospitals which are still operating. There are only few hospitals and medical facilities that are still operating, and we need significant supplies, crucially important for the saving of lives, particularly for the children and women being targeted in the civilian areas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will now go to Mr. Windsor, and you have up to 10 minutes as well.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to provide evidence at this hearing. We're grateful for the opportunity. By way of introduction, my organisation, Middle East Concern, is an association which was established in 1991 in response to needs expressed by Christian leaders in the Middle East North Africa region. MEC's member organisations and member individuals include Christians living and working in all 24 countries and territories covered by MEC. MEC provides support to Christians in the MENA region who are persecuted on account of their faith, either for being or choosing to become Christian. MEC assists individual victims of religious persecution, challenges unjust laws, policies and attitudes, and equips Christians to prepare for, mitigate and respond to persecution. We collaborate expansively with our networks of individuals and organisations in the MENA region and globally to provide the support and assistance required in any given situation. Now, regarding the circumstances of Christians in government-controlled areas of Syria, most of Syria's Christians belong to historical Orthodox and Catholic churches, and in addition, there are some traditional Protestant churches as well. And these communities are primarily found in areas of Syria controlled by President Assad's regime. They have generally enjoyed reasonable standing in society. For example, the current Speaker of Parliament is an Orthodox Christian. However, Christians have been affected by the ongoing conflict and the economic hardship as much as anyone else. Church leaders overwhelmingly express support for President Assad's regime, at least in public. There are several reasons for this, including that the Assad regime has traditionally granted significant freedoms to Christians. The fact that even if Christian communities don't endorse all that the Assad regime stands for, they fear that any alternative regime would be very much more hostile to Christians. And also some church leaders are exercising some self-interest in publicly stating support for the regime, as they rely on the patronage of the regime. As Assad consolidates his position, Christians are amongst those concerned that he is making concessions to Islamists. In particular, there were concerns around the introduction of what's known as Law 16 in September 2018, which was purportedly designed to combat extremist ideology while promoting moderation. This law proposed significant expansion of the powers of the Ministry of Religious Endowments, the Awqaf ministry, at the expense of other ministries and public institutions. The proposals were criticised, including within otherwise loyalist circles, on grounds that increased power of Sunni religious authorities would hand greater influence to the Islamists and in turn threaten the secular nature and culture of the Syrian state. An unprecedented outcry led to some modification of the proposals. However, the final version, which is known as Law 31, still bolsters the power of the Ministry of Religious Endowments. Some church leaders are worried that churches will face increased obstacles in bureaucratic procedures because of this law. Some have provided other examples of the ways in which Christians suffer a degree of marginalization under the Assad regime. For example, we've received claims that Christian soldiers within the Syrian army are given more dangerous postings or duties, or that Christian civil servants have received inferior treatment than others. In those areas which are still under Islamist control, principally Idlib province, the Christian presence is very small, not least because of outward migration in earlier stages of the conflict following a number of attacks on church buildings and Christian communities. Only very small numbers of Christians remain, and amongst those who are left, there has been no move towards return. Primarily because of the security situation, but also because of fears that the dominant controlling militant groups, especially Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, continue to impose a strict Islamist agenda. In Afrin, Christians who are amongst the thousands displaced by Turkish-backed militias in early 2018 have reported the desecration of church buildings and appropriation of buildings belonging to Christians, though such claims are also made by others among the thousands, most of them Kurds, who have been displaced. It is claimed that the controlling factions have facilitated a program of demographic engineering by settling Sunni IDPs from other parts of Syria in properties abandoned by Kurds and Christians. Although Daesh, otherwise known as Islamic State, has been defeated militarily, there are fears that violence inspired by Daesh ideology could still erupt, and that minority religious communities could be vulnerable to such violence, as demonstrated by atrocities against Druze communities in July 2018 in Sweda, for which Daesh claimed responsibility. The predominantly Kurdish areas of northeast Syria include sizable Assyrian and Syriac Christian communities. Recent political developments have been of concern to some within these communities, in particular the imposition of a Kurdish political agenda and an intensifying standoff with Damascus, as Kurdish demands for significant autonomy are rebuffed by President Assad. Christian communities, though appreciative of the greater degree of pluralism typically permitted by the Kurdish administration, resent a renewed drive to assert Kurdish identity, demonstrated, for example, in a church leader's objections to the imposition of a new Kurdish curriculum on all schools in the region, including church schools, in 2018. The appeals of Syrian church leaders are broader than simply for their own communities. They make a compelling argument that the preservation of Syria's ethnic and religious diversity through consolidating pluralism is vital for the benefit of all communities. It should be noted that calls for pluralism go beyond appeals for peaceable intercommunal coexistence. There remains a strong social taboo on religious conversion in Syria, reinforced by personal status laws, especially for those who choose to convert from Islam to Christianity or indeed any other religion. This is in contravention of internationally agreed standards for freedom of religion or belief, which hold that there must be freedom to change one's religion. If the international community has any sway over the reconstruction of Syria, we would request that they work to ensure that the current and future legal frameworks in Syria fully promote and protect the equal and inalienable rights of all their citizens, irrespective of race, religion, or other status, to ensure the dignified and continued improvement of living conditions for all citizens, but especially for returning refugees and the internally displaced, including through the provision of adequate housing, education and jobs, and that they would equip religious leaders and faith-based organizations to play a constructive and central role in reconciling and rebuilding Syrian society. I'll close with a quote from a spokesman for the Antiochian Orthodox Patriarchate. He has said, "We have to find a peaceful solution in the country. The displaced and refugees should be able to return. The current situation has to come to an end, and we must find ways to motivate people to reconcile and heal together." Thank you.
Thank you very much to both of you for your testimony. We will start with Mr. Sweet for 7 minutes of question.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'd like to thank both witnesses for their efforts, although much different, their efforts to save lives and help the persecuted. My first question I'd like to ask Mr. Al-Qasim. It's my understanding that most of the medical facilities were underground, and they revealed their locations to the United Nations. This was under the premise that there was going to be some deconfliction process, and then they ended up being shared with Moscow and Damascus, and they were targeted. I don't know when the last time was when you were there, but how has this affected those people who are in the medical missions there now, knowing that they're targeted, and one of the groups that they trusted, is, I'm certain that they feel very betrayed. But how has it impacted their spirit in staying with the battle?
Thank you very much for the question. So I've been, as I mentioned before, in Syria on many missions, actually, including Aleppo itself during the intense airstrikes on Aleppo in 2015, 2016. So in fact, most of the hospitals are, regular buildings, but we operate in the basement. So they're not really underground. They're buildings, but most of the time we don't dare to use the upper levels because the very high risk to be bombarded by the airstrikes, particularly the very advanced Russian airstrikes now, as opposed to 2015 or before, where Assad airstrikes were predominantly were bombarding the buildings. So we do operate in the basement, and we did share actually our locations with both the Russian and the Turkish and UN. And unfortunately, even 3 recently shared locations were bombarded by the Russian airstrikes. Recently. So the 24 medical facilities, you're right, we share their locations, and we got some reassurance by UN and by OCHA in Gaziantep that if you share these locations with us, we'll communicate that to the Russian and be sure they're not going to be bombarded. But there was no respect at all. To be honest with you, when I communicate to the medical staff on the ground, they have no trust whatsoever with the international community. And going back to my colleague, that's causing actually that no trust with the international community, with the promises, will aggravate more violence and will aggravate more extremism in northern Syria, which we never witnessed before, because now they're saying the international community is helping Assad and is helping Russia. It's not helping us. I'm talking about the medical aid workers and civilians. So the other groups, they see this as an opportunity to inherit them, to convince them to be part of the Daesh and Hayat al-Nusra and all these extreme group, and that's a big concern. And there has been really discrimination against all kind of civilians, not only Christian, the Sunni, the Kurd, and all kind of population and groups and ethnic groups in Syria have been targeted by the Syrian regime and the Russian allies. So that's a big concern for us, and unfortunately we have communicated our concerns to UN and to WHO several times, but there was no respect by the Russian air forces.
I want to affirm the one thing that you said earlier. I was on the Jordanian-Syrian border in 2014, and we welcomed 700 refugees at the time, and the vast majority of them had been bombed out of places 3-4 times. They'd been bombed out of their own house and then gone to a friend's or an uncle's or an aunt's and then was bombed out of there, and many of them had walked their own shoes off just trying to get to safety. My question is Jordan and Lebanon still open for these displaced people, or have they are starting to mitigate the number of refugees they accept?
Definitely, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, and even Turkey, now they have closed the borders. So none of these countries, because they have 1 million each for Jordan and Lebanon and over 3 million refugees in Turkey, so none of them are interested to take any more refugees. And that's why I'm very concerned. I've been in Aleppo and I've been in Hama and Idlib before, but at least the borders were open at that time. So people, they were seek refuge to Turkey and then to Europe and to Canada eventually. But at the current time, the borders are closed, and every single country made it clear that we cannot take more responsibilities for refugees. So that's a big concern for these villages and towns being wiped out at the current time.
Sure. Mr. Anderson will take the rest of the...
Thank you. Thanks both of our witnesses for being here today. Doctor, I'd just like to ask you, some of the strongholds have been taken back over the time by Assad's government, and it's meant imprisonment for a lot of people. And I'm just wondering, you've got about 2.5 million people, I think, in the Idlib area. It sounds like over 1 million of them have come from other places, have moved there, and both of you as witnesses have talked about that movement of population, the disruption that it brings. But I'm just wondering, what is the situation there? How long do you expect the opposition to be able to hold out? Is this something that will be a long-term thing? Will it be like some of the other places that we've talked about at this committee that were in opposition when we talked to them, but then within a matter of a month or so were taken over by the Assad government? I'm just wondering if you can give us an update on that situation.
So you're right. There's more than 2.5 million people now, a population in Idlib, which was previous before the war about 1 million population. And there's only 1 in Idlib city itself, there's 1 million population, and many of these people, they already came, as you mentioned, displaced from other areas. Some of them, they've been displaced twice and 3 times, and this is the 3rd time or 4th time being displaced. Imagine that kind of displacement. It's horrible, never been in the history before, I guess. And so currently, our data shows there's more than 425,000 new internally displaced people out of their villages and towns due to these intense airstrikes. But they've been pushed to northern area and some of them to city Idlib. Our concern, if city Idlib itself, with 1 million population, is if it's going to be targeted by the airstrikes, then we will probably witness the largest humanitarian crisis from the beginning of the war. And our concern is that the hospitals in the border, they're still operating, but we cannot really deal with big influx of injuries if they target the city of Idlib.
Thank you very much. That's your time. We will now go to Ms. Khalid for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both witnesses, Dr. Al-Ghassam and also Mr. Windsor, for your time and for your advocacy on saving so many lives in Syria. Dr. Anas, I'll start with you, if that's okay. You'd spoken in your testimony about chemical weapons being used, and then you had also mentioned about data. Now, are you collecting data as well? I know that is really not the mandate of your organization on the ground, or you're providing humanitarian aid and medical relief, but are you also collecting and then identifying and just making notes of what is happening on the ground to be used later on, perhaps in the international community?
Yeah, thank you very much. We're medical workers, as you mentioned, Ikra. We're physicians at the end of the day, but we were forced to collect data, particularly with regard to chemical weapons, because we have medical staff on the ground. They receive the injuries. We know the symptoms and signs. So for instance, a week ago roughly, we confirmed clinically at least that chlorine gas has been used. The symptoms are very clear to us now after 6 or 7 years of repeated use of this kind of gas. And phosphorus gas was used as well, at least clinically we could confirm that, by the severe burns of injuries, which has happened a week ago as well in one of the villages. We were still waiting for the Organization of the Protection of Chemical Weapons to confirm that. We are communicating the specimens to them, so that may take some time. But certainly the clinical evidence is there for repeated uses of chlorine gas and phosphorus.
Thank you. And are there other organizations providing humanitarian aid on the ground that you are currently partnering with that is helping you through this process?
Correct. We have the Syrian American Medical Society that have been big partners for us, and we've been communicating with the WHO as well. They don't have facilities that they're operating on the ground, but they do supply us with medical supplies, and we're sharing the data with them as well.
Thank you. So I guess, it's really unfortunate. There's so many hundreds and thousands of people displaced with nowhere to go, it seems like, with borders closing. So I ask you first, Dr. Anas, and I'll turn to Mr. Windsor as well after. What's next? What do you envision in the short term for Syria as well as in the long term?
I'd like to see the international community and the Canadian government stand up. And first of all, we need to raise emergency funds for the medical aids and the medical supplies. And we're in big shortage of at least $500,000 in terms of medical supplies, and particularly for the mobile clinics, because many villages and towns, we have no access to them. We have no physicians or nurses on the ground anymore. So the mobile clinics are a great solution, and we have been operating many mobile clinics in northern Syria, and we really need emergency funds for these mobile clinics. We need to ensure that the international community and particularly Canada ensure the cross-border and cross-line humanitarian access to be maintained through Jordan, through Lebanon, and through Turkey, particularly since most of the operations are carrying on now in Idlib, which is close to the Turkish border. We need to urge the leaders from the Istanbul summit between France, Germany, Russia, and Turkey to uphold their commitment to maintain the ceasefire in Idlib that they have promised, and to stop the systematic attacks on hospitals and schools. 10 schools were attacked since the 28th of April, and as I mentioned, many medical facilities, including 24, were completely destroyed and out of service for now. So this is what we envision as a quick solution for the coming few weeks. But on long term, we hope that we can find a political solution where Assad, Daesh, and Nusra, all these groups, we envision them as very dangerous, and they have committed certainly war crimes against humanity.
Thank you. Mr. Windsor, would you like to comment on that as well?
Partly only to say that I concur with the doctor who spoke very eloquently to that situation. Obviously, it's vital that those humanitarian access routes are open, and that also the diplomatic process continues. That there are redoubled efforts in terms of resolving this conflict because of the humanitarian crisis that's been ongoing for so long now.
Thank you. Chair Dwight.
2 minutes.
That's wonderful. Thank you. I've been told I have 2 more minutes. I was cutting my questions a bit short. But Dr. Anas, you had spoken about the political solution. How do we get rid of the threats to humanity within that region? You mentioned Daesh and the Assad regime. Are there any other political players within that region that are inhibiting a long-term solution from being found?
Well, I think Turkey and Russia are the main players currently because they have troops on the ground, they have military bases, and I'd like to see more engagement of the international community, including Canada, with Turkey and Russia, and to uphold them accountable for their promises before, for the commitment for the ceasefire, and to work with them to honor their commitments to the so-called demilitarized zone agreement, which was signed back in September 2018. I think it's very crucial to engage more with Russia and Turkey, because without these two major players in the area, I don't think we're going to achieve a political solution.
Thank you. And my last question to you, Doctor, I understand that you lost some Canadian lives there who had gone to volunteer and to provide medical relief in Syria. So I ask, how are you providing safety and security for the people that are working with your organization on the ground providing relief?
So as I mentioned before, unfortunately, even sharing the locations of these hospitals haven't been very fruitful in the past. So we currently work only at the border, try not to send our crews to the villages and towns under attack, try just to go to the camps where it's reasonably safe and hasn't been under attack in the last few weeks. And the major hub for us is right at the border, and we hope that this hospital won't be bombed, at least.
Thank you very much. I also note that the bells are ringing. Do I have consent of the committee to continue? We could just do the one last question of this round, or we could probably get in another round of 3 or 4 questions if we leave 10 minutes before, since we're in the same building. Is that okay? All right. So go ahead, Ms. Hardcastle.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for your work and for your insights here today. I just want to go back and talk a little bit about moving forward, how Canada can actually be more vocal or more impactful in the international community. And it was suggested that, we need to stand up and we need to raise voices. And as an international community, we have to leverage certain things better. One of them that intrigued me was you talked about the mobile clinics and about this issue of medical supplies. Now, has Canada or has the international community spoken out at all or effectively so far in terms of ceasefires or humanitarian corridors or identifying support that's needed specifically to get, let's say, medical supplies to a specific area? Or have we just been speaking in generalities thus far. I'd like the both of you to explore and talk a little bit about maybe how we can be moving the needle, so to speak, or advancing if we look at specific issues or specific areas. And another one would be, are there areas where we could be concentrating on deactivating landmines, or is there specific work? And I'll leave it at that. Maybe we can start with you, Doctor, and I'll give you both the remainder of my time to comment on ways that we can specifically work towards providing that access.
Thank you very much for the question. So I think we do have two avenues. We do want to mix between the two. The political solution, this war has been now for 7 years. The war is a humanitarian crisis on Earth for a decade or more than that. But the problem is that we did not achieve any political solution. Unfortunately, Russia is part of the issue because they're supporting the Syrian regime and they're not really backing up into finding a political solution. So I think we should continue putting pressure and on Russia and Turkey and all these players, on the ground to find a political solution, a ceasefire, no-fly zone, and respect the civilians. We have to keep pressuring them. But on the other hand, I found the Canadian government can do a little bit more immediate kind of release of funds for emergency medical aid, for humanitarian aids, because there is a crisis going on in Idlib now. And we're not talking about millions and millions. Probably, as I mentioned, our estimation that we need 500,000 of medical supplies and probably similar amount or so to make the mobile clinics, which are very crucial in Idlib when the villages are attacked, because they can move between the villages and to the camps and to the areas where the displaced children and women from all ethnicities are found, and provide them with medications and drugs, assessment, screening, and so forth, and then be able to transfer them safely to the border hospitals like the one we have at the border, the Babel Howe Hospital. So I think there are two avenues, and I hope that the Canadian government can start at least immediately with emergency funds to help such organizations working in the war zone, and then keep pushing on the political avenue as well.
Thank you very much. And Mr. Windsor?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think in addition, it's important that I think that there's a sense where there's been a certain amount of fatigue over the conflict and the crisis in Syria, and it's losing its profile in the media, in terms of the public agenda, and I think we need to make sure that it stays on the agenda, that we are highlighting and bringing to the attention of the public and the world what is happening in these places, and that should be a part of the strategy for pushing Turkey, Russia to fulfill their obligations to change tack in the way that they're operating in Syria.
That's good. That's good. Okay, we'll now go to Ms. Khalid try to keep it under 4 minutes.
I just have, I guess, a small question. In April of 2019, so earlier this year, the government, our government, Canadian government, condemned what was happening in Syria, and we announced $2 million of funding to provide support for the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. I know we talked about this earlier when I was asking. Do you think that kind of support is helpful in curbing what is ongoing? Do you think that the focus of the government, or do you think the focus of the government should be more on providing the medical relief and the humanitarian aid to that? If Dr. Anas, if you can comment on that, please.
Thank you, Ikra, for the question. So I think we need more emergency funding to the operations of the clinics, particularly the large hospitals like Babel Howe and the mobile clinics. There's lots of stress, lots of pressure on these few remaining clinics and facilities in northern Syria. And if they fall apart, then these injuries from children and women that we witness on a daily basis due to the airstrikes. They have nowhere to go, particularly as we mentioned early on today that the Turkish border, Lebanese border, Jordanian border has been pretty much closed up against these refugees. So we need to understand that it's not like 2015 and 16 where the borders were sort of open. Currently, we have a real crisis. We need to put some emergency funds into the ground, into Idlib. And I know we met before with the Foreign Affairs in Canada, and they mentioned Idlib because of the military action. It's not major interest for the Foreign Affairs, but I hope they change that kind of interest now, because we have no way for these refugees, for these injured to go outside Syria. So we have to focus from the humanitarian portion on an emergency basis, focus on that area and put some emergency funds forward for these clinics, for these humanitarian organizations, and particularly the hospitals taking all these injuries.
Thank you. Those are all the questions I have.
Thank you very much. We'll now go to Mr. Anderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Both of you touched a little bit on the displacement of local communities, and I asked a question about that a little earlier, but one of the things that we've studied prior was Nineveh Plain and people trying to return to that area, finding that their communities were under the control of other people and a justice system that isn't functional. I'm just wondering if both of you would like to comment on that. I think, Mr. Windsor, you made a comment towards that issue, and if you'd fill that out a little bit, and then the doctor could follow you with that. But as these people are returning to their communities in areas where they can, what are they finding, and are the structures in place that allow them to return to their communities and to be able to successfully, if you want to call it, integrate or reintegrate with their neighbors and the people that they lived with in the past?
Thank you. Yeah, the challenge at the moment in Nineveh Plain is it's largely different to what we see in Syria, but in Nineveh Plain there is a degree of lawlessness where militants from the Popular Mobilization Unit are creating instability and intimidating. There's intimidation and harassment. There's also a sense that there is this demographic engineering that's happening where areas which would have been traditionally of one religious group would be there would be developments, there would be people buying properties and putting up religious buildings, religious party headquarters and that sort of thing, and there's a sense that these moves are designed to discourage return of refugees and IDPs to these areas, to these towns, because there's still a sense that there isn't the stability they need in order to bring their families back there. And
what do you see in Syria then as well? Is it similar to that, or is it different because of the government has reestablished control?
Well, in terms of Syria, I think that there isn't a sense, certainly, that there are disproportionate numbers of Christians, for example, that have left Syria. There's what affects Christians in Syria reflects a lot of other groups and minorities. So, and they've fled because not only of the general security situation, but lack of economic prospects and opportunity, and fear of forcible conscription to Syrian army, rather than necessarily the targeting of specific Christian communities. So it's a different sort of tension.
Different situation. Doctor, what would be your response to that?
So in areas like Zabadani, which is a suburb of Damascus, when it was controlled by the regime, unfortunately, I've heard from many of my colleagues, this is an area I used to visit when I was a child almost on a weekly basis. It's a beautiful area on the mountain. I've heard from my colleagues that their lands have been taken over by Hezbollah, who is the main military area, group on the ground currently, and they're identified as terrorists as well, and they have control of the lands, so the people won't be able to go back to their lands. And that's my concern in Idlib. In Gap area, there's lots of Christians and Muslims that lived there for years and years, a beautiful area in the middle of Damascus. I've been there many times in the past, visiting them in the summer. And my concern, if the Syrian regime or Daesh or one of these groups will control these areas, I don't think the people will be able to go back to their own lands and their houses.
Just for clarity, is Hezbollah aligned with Assad's regime in that area?
Correct, 100%. So this is the area, Damascus suburb, they're allied with the Syrian regime, and they have controlled lands on the ground.
Okay, thank you very much. And for one final short question, Ms. Hardcastle.
Thank you. Doctor, maybe you can just expand on that a little bit. And I don't know if we'll have time for Mr. Windsor to chime in. Just talk to us a little bit about these rebel groups that are in Idlib and what is the potential. You discussed earlier about a political solution. Are there opportunities there that we should be looking at if we look at these groups?
Yeah, so the rebels group controlling Idlib are mixed. So there are some groups are considered extreme, like the Hayat Nusra, they call them, and there are other groups that are just people defected from the Syrian regime, regular people and even civilians. They're trying to defend themselves, their women, their children in the Gab area, Idlib, and northern Hama. I know many physicians, many families in the area, and they were just regular civilian people. So they're mixed, really. But at least if Russia is mandating Hayat Nusra to be out, I think we should work on that, because I suspect this is the reason why they're wiping out the area. I think they want to just declare that they won the war and they control the whole Syria after being engaged heavily, the Russian air forces from September 2015. But I think we should continue the avenue of discussion with Turkey and Russia and the local groups on the ground. And if we can get these rebels out of the Idlib area, we'll see if Russia will stop, although I doubt they will stop the attacks.
Time. Mr. Windsor?
Yeah, I rarely get the opportunity to agree with my co-contributors as much as I've had the opportunity today. But yeah, I mean, the doctors identified one of the main challenges in terms of those groups, in terms of the mixed character. There are extremists, and even within the groups themselves, there will be often a mix of extremists and more moderate factions. So it makes it very challenging to have a real sense of who it would be that would be the people to speak to, what the picture would look like if any of these particular groups or the rebel factions gained any success or support. I mean, it's difficult to identify a solution that way, but as the doctor said, we just need to be pushing for increased dialogue and holding the other players, the other actors in this field to account.
Thank you very much. I want to thank you, Dr. Anas Al-Qassem and Miles Windsor, for your testimony today. We will now suspend the meeting while we go to vote. We'll release our witnesses, and when we come back, we will get our update on the human rights situation in Cameroon. So we are suspending. Resuming our committee meeting now, and my apologies for the delay. There were votes in the House, but we now are going to be beginning our session on the update on the human rights situation in Cameroon. The committee will recall that we did have a session on Cameroon, and today's session is to get an update on what the circumstances are today. And we have by video conference 2 witnesses. We have Scott Morgan, who is the chair of the Africa Working Group with the International Religious Freedom Roundtable, and he is coming to us by video conference from Washington, D.C. We also have Titi Agbahe, who is a campaigner for Central Africa at Amnesty International's regional office for West and Central Africa, which is based in Dakar, Senegal, and she is coming to us by video conference from Senegal. So we will have 10 minutes from each of our witnesses, and then we will go into questions. So we will begin with you, Mr. Morgan. You have 10 minutes for your opening remarks.
Thank you, and good afternoon, Madam Chairman. My name is Scott Morgan. I am the chair of the Africa Working Group for the International Religious Freedom Caucus Roundtable, based here in Washington, D.C. Although the group includes various representations from several religious groups, it should be noted that I am making these remarks on my own behalf. It would be a great disservice without thanking the Honorable Mr. Anderson for the invitation to brief the honorable members of Parliament, and for his service defending freedom of religion and belief around the world. It is sad to hear that he is not standing for re-election, and I personally wish him well in his future endeavors. Currently, the issue of defending religious liberty in Cameroon is one of the most difficult tasks that can be undertaken right now. Most media outlets are well too eager to categorize the violence as a one-dimensional conflict between the state and separatists, and overlook the various religious components that are under the surface. One of the best examples of this has been the reaction to the death of the Indiana-born missionary Charles Truman Wesco, a mere 2 weeks after he entered the country, and who left behind 8 children, or even the random murder of 8 priests who were actually on their way to seminary for training. These are incidents that you generally fall off the radar. Moreover, the series of abductions of students from St. Augustine College and other Presbyterian schools highlight another debate which overshadows the religious aspect, that being education. The government in Yaoundé has undertaken several steps to send French-speaking teachers to the Anglophone region in order for them to learn French and have them speak that as their primary language instead of English. Most analysts concur that this act is one of the most serious concerns regarding human rights and may be the underlying factor as the root cause of this conflict. A rising issue is the one in which the Mamboros, an ethnic tribe that has close ties to the to the Fulanis, are being forced to swear loyalty to the government of Paul Biya. This strategy can be viewed as a counterintelligence strategy with the goal of possibly ensuring or increasing the military assistance provided by the United States. The concern is that the Amazonian separatists will actually target the Mamboros by seeing them as actual agents of the Cameroonian government, which will in turn give the Cameroonian government cover to actually go into the region with a heavy presence and impose its will. So this would actually give the government some form of cover to explain some of the incidents where other priests, nuns, and seminary students have been killed as a result of this operation. This action could make the conflict worse by actually turning it into a religious conflict, because even though it will actually stating that stating that the actions of the Fulani would be a concern that would actually force some actors to say this is a religious conflict and we should actually enforce this will be a religious conflict that appears that the Biya government is willing to pay the price for in order to remain in power. Another major growing concern is the rights of refugees. Shortly after the re-election of President Buhari in Nigeria, the repatriation of refugees back into Nigeria began almost immediately. It is still a grave concern due to the fact that there are some of the areas where they're being repatriated to in Nigeria Boko Haram is still active, and the group has recently launched attacks against both interests in Nigeria and Cameroon. However, a rising concern, which often does not make forums like this, is the growing concern of the silence over what's going on with the refugees from the Central African Republic who are in the process of being hosted by the Cameroonians. There are growing reports of both Seleka and the anti-Balakas are actually recruiting and organizing fighters in the camps in the eastern part of the country. And these factors alone are creating a ticking time bomb that could explode at any moment. The situation should be addressed as soon as possible. For further, one of the best sources of the current climate regarding the refugees, I refer you to the recent report by Refugees International regarding the situation in Cameroon amongst the refugee camps. This was just recently released within the last 30 days, so it is a good snapshot of what is currently ongoing in this realm. Another concern is how social media has been effectively used in this. Although most of the criticism has been levied against the Biya government, both sides have released videos on various social media platforms that have been criticized as being propaganda or fake news. These actions make verifications and investigations of events that have taken place on the ground more difficult, as some people are more inclined to believe the information from one source is more credible than the other. It has been recently discovered that local stringers for such international media outlets, such as the Voice of America, are actually on the payroll for CRTV, which is a state-owned media company. The Cameroonian government has also taken other measures to ensure that these atrocities do not see the light of day. During Q&A, I will actually be able to explain some of the moves that they have taken here in Washington to actually suppress information and other concerns that are rising in the region. Recently, several reports, including from the Wallenberg Institute, have stated that requested the Canadian government to step in and be one of the parties that helped mediate in this conflict. Considering the history that within the issue regarding Quebec and Canada's long-standing ties with Cameroon dating back to the days of independence, this may be an actual good idea. Currently, the only way forward to resolve the conflicts in Cameroon is by mediation. There most likely will not be a military solution. Recently, the U.S. Undersecretary of State for Africa, Tibor Nagy, who visited Cameroon in March of this year, stated that there is a necessary means for mediation as well. This statement can be taken as an official policy decision by the Trump administration. As soon as it's practical, I urge a consultation between the Canadian Foreign Ministry staff dealing with Africa and Mr. Nagy to undertake a joint strategy about mediation. This is not the only branch of the U.S. government that is interested in the situation. Recently, Congress has introduced H.Res. 358, which is a bill which calls for mediation to take place in the country. One of the provisions in there calls for the mediation to be conducted by the religious community inside the country. However, in an attempt in November 2018 by the Anglophone speakers of the Roman Catholic Church and several Protestant groups was actually thwarted by the governor of the Southwest state, citing vaguely suggesting that this effort would be breaking Cameroonian law. The U.S. legislation does not have a provision to safeguard the leaders as they attempt to bring about mediation in this conflict. That is an oversight that I have urged that the U.S. to be taken up by the Congress here. Any effort by the Canadian government should also suggest some type of protection for the mediators as well. Finally, it appears that the UN will take no action to eradicate the conflict. A recent briefing of the UN Security Council regarding the situation in Cameroon found that both Russia and China felt that this is an internal matter, and if this was an actual vote on a Security Council resolution, it would have been vetoed. Therefore, Canada has a unique position where it can work with key members of the Commonwealth in the AU to seek redress for the peoples of Cameroon. Even though CMAG was suspended for the year, it should not be an excuse not to take action regarding this. We have noted the recent actions by the African Union in suspending Sudan for the violence that has taken place in the country after the overthrow of Omar Bashir. This could be have the quickness with which this their suspension from this AU could be used as a model for what could be taking place within Cameroon if it's properly discussed by its peers. Another action from the Commonwealth Ministerial Group that could be taken is the setting up of a working group within the body, similar to what took place in Zimbabwe after the controversial 2002 elections. A three-nation working group was set up to discuss how the internal political situation in Zimbabwe could be addressed to the resolution of all. Ultimately, that issue did fail and was set off to the side after the 2008 elections. It could also be a way for Canada to extensively heighten its presence as a diplomatic player in this field.
Thank you very much, Mr. Morgan, for that testimony. We will now go to Ms. Agbaje for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mrs. Chairman. To members of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights Law, Human Rights, we, Amnesty International, are relieved that the issue in Cameroon is gaining attention. Amnesty International has been working in and on Cameroon for 5 years now, documenting numerous human rights violations and abuses. Allow me to give you a broad view of what's happening in Cameroon, not only in the Anglophone regions, but basically in all the country. Cameroon is in a very difficult regional context where the rational security versus human rights is gaining more and more ground, and basically the states seem to think that any human rights violation can be justified by the fact that they're protecting the people and country against whatever they consider a threat. Cameroon is facing multiple crises. The first one being Boko Haram in the northern regions. The second one is not by order of importance, it's rather by chronological order. So the first one is Boko Haram. The second one is the crisis in the Anglophone regions. And the third one that just started a few months ago is the post-electoral crackdown in Yaoundé and Douala. So as I was saying, Cameroon is surrounded by very sensitive countries that themselves are dealing with their own threats. Cameroon is surrounded by the Central African Republic, Chad, Nigeria, and is very engaged in the fight against Boko Haram in the Lake Chad region. So while we consider as Amnesty International that their fight is legitimate, the means that they're using are not. In the response of the Cameroonian authorities to the fight against Boko Haram, security forces have committed a huge number of human rights violations and abuses. They have committed arbitrary arrests and detention, torture, systematic use of torture, enforced disappearance, death in custody, unlawful killing sometimes. They are basically using the same pattern of human rights violations in the Anglophone regions. So whatever Cameroon considers a threat, whatever they consider a risk to their security, we see for 5 years, we started this 5 years ago, we see that the reaction is basically the same. The human rights violation and abuses, the pattern of human rights violations and abuses is basically the same. So what the security forces did in the northern regions, what they have been doing is not over yet. What they have been doing in the northern regions since 2014, they're doing exactly the same in the Anglophone regions now. Unlawful detention, arrest and detention, systematic use of torture, unlawful killing, death in custody. The specificity of the crisis of the Anglophone regions is that it's gaining for once, is gaining more attention than what's happening in the northern regions. And it's gaining attention thanks to the fact that the Anglophone diaspora is present almost everywhere and they're very powerful, which is a good thing. It means that basically it's why we're here. It basically means that for once, what's happening in Cameroon is gaining the attention that it needs to gain. Our recommendation as Amnesty International, both for the crisis in the north but also the crisis in the Anglophone regions, is that the Cameroonian authorities investigate all allegations of torture, of unlawful detention. I'm specifically thinking regarding the crisis in the northern regions of a village in the northern parts, just north Marwa, in a village in which more than 100 people, men, only men, 130 men disappeared in 2014. The families have not heard from them for 5 years now. It has to be investigated. That's just one example of what happened in the northern region and is happening now in the Anglophone regions. The third crisis that Cameroon is facing is the post-electoral crackdown. At the end of January, Maurice Kamto, who is the main political opponent in the country, organized peaceful demonstration to protest what he considers mass irregularities during the latest presidential election. During those protests, peaceful protesters were arrested and arbitrarily detained. They are still in detention as we talk. There's more than 130 people in detention now in Cameroon. Some of them have not even taken part in that demonstration. Maurice Kamto himself was arrested in the house of a friend. Lawyer Michel Ndoki and hip-hop activist Valsero are among the people arrested and still in detention. Just to show you how systematic the crackdown and the repression is in Cameroon, there's a woman who has been arrested. So basically, the woman was the cleaning lady. She was present in the house when security forces came in and asked people not to move, and then they were taken to police station and then to the prisons. That woman is in detention now. She is accused of charges that could lead to the death penalty. So my intervention is basically around the fact that even if there are multiple crises in Cameroon, even if from far it could seem like those crises have no links around among them, there is a clear pattern in the way that the Cameroonian authorities react to the crisis, and it has to be stopped. It has to be stopped because we have been working on this for 5 years, and basically for 5 years we have been telling people, look at Cameroon. Look at Cameroon. Don't look at Cameroon only thinking they are key in the region in the fight against Boko Haram. Look at what's happening inside the country also. All signals in Cameroon are red as we speak. And one example of that is the fact that they denied entry to the researcher of Human Rights Watch. She tried to go into the country for a research mission just a few months ago, and she was denied entry in the country. It's always a bad signal when a country started denying entry to foreigners or any people they consider to be not on the site, as they say. So our recommendations to the Cameroonian authority, of course, to investigate, to send a clear message to the security forces that they should not allow impunity to prevail, and to the partners of Cameroon, human rights issues should be in the priority issues that the country discuss with Cameroon. It shouldn't come after the security issue. It shouldn't come after the role that Cameroon is playing in the region. Those two things are linked, and Canada, as a fellow member of the Commonwealth, has one key specific role to play also, because it hasn't happened yet that members of Commonwealth will address Cameroon. It has been for now France and the US mainly, but Canada has a role to play here in being one more actor to just flag to Cameroon that although the fight is legitimate, whatever fight it is legitimate, the means that they're using is wrong. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Agbaje, to both of our witnesses. We'll begin the questions now with Mr. Anderson for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses for being with us today, and thank you, Mr. Morgan, for those generous words at the beginning. I want to ask you about lack of discipline by government forces. We understand this is a complex issue and there's a number of different players involved here, but one of the common themes seems to be government forces, excessive violence. I'm just wondering if you can talk a bit about that. Is it a lack of discipline? Is it a deliberate escalation by leadership that's causing this to happen? And I note that the U.S., Germany, France, China, and Israel all supply arms to the military. Is it possible that between them that they could, bring some restraint through the pressures of cutting those military supplies? I know the U.S. has already cut back a bit, but could you just talk to that a bit? Is this a lack of discipline with government forces? Is it a deliberate escalation of violence that's being done for some people's purposes?
I would say that this is a deliberate escalation. And also, before I go any further, you may want to add another country to that list of countries that supply weapons to Cameroon, and that would be the United Arab Emirates, because they supply 27 armored cars in the short period between the time of the election last October, and the time that results were actually announced. So that is a very interesting timeline to actually look at as well. But it seems that most of the atrocities that we're seeing video-wise and everything, it seems to be local units on the ground. Because, the U.S. policy now is that units that actually receive training under the terms of the Lake Chad Basin Initiative, those in the north dealing with Boko Haram, they are still able to receive military assistance from the United States. Those that are unlike the rest of the units of the Cameroonian military, because also the U.S. has also pulled out 150 trainers that were on the ground training the military last year as well. That was just one of the first steps. But obviously,
I have a very short time here. I'm just wondering, are you suggesting then as local commanders that are escalating the violence?
That would be suggested because, concerning there's been very little criticism of what's been going on from Yaoundé, that could be a fact that has to be considered, because you don't see any criticisms by the senior leadership unless groups like Amnesty or others speak out against it. That's the only time that they will actually address the violence.
Ms. Agbahi, can you address that as well?
Yes, from a human rights point of view, I would say is the reign of impunity. I work on 5 countries in Central Africa, and while situations and dynamics are very different, in Chad, for example, is absolutely the same thing. The military is above everything. They're above law, and the state basically gives them the right to do whatever they want. There's a specific unit in Cameroon that's involved in the fight both against Boko Haram, but also in the Anglophone regions, which is called the BIR, is Bataillon d'Intervention Rapide in French. They are supposed to be trained for specific war. So they consider that to be a war against Boko Haram, but it's actually a war against the people, whoever the people may be. So it's impunity, and is also the fact that nobody is addressing that. Nobody is really telling the Cameroonian government that those people should be charged with criminal charges. They should be charged before civil courts. So what happens is sometimes they will say that the people responsible for that have been tried before military courts, but it's usually stay at the administrative level. They don't carry any serious charges. So it's basically change them region. So you, for example, find the same person who was responsible for something in one city being transferred to another city.
Can I ask you, do they have Francophone and Anglophone units in the military, or are they combined? You mentioned that. Is that an issue as well in terms of the conflict?
It's usually Francophone. I have yet to meet some Anglophone among them, but it's usually Francophones in that unit.
Hey, just moving quickly along, I noticed in some of our material that some of the Anglophone schools have been shut down for 2 years, and this is common when we see conflict areas. The first thing that seems to go is children's access to education. I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the situation is that typically leads to a lost generation of young people and then further conflict. So if you don't mind addressing that. And I had one more question of Mr. Morgan, and that was you wanted to talk about suppressing information outside of Cameroon. If you could get ready just to address that issue on how the government has been suppressing the information outside of Cameroon, perhaps if I've got enough time for that. So please talk about the schools, if you would, first.
Seeing that it's a struggle with the schools because, as you know, forcing people who speak one language to learn another, some people, that is a major concern. And that is one of the criticisms that the government has been leveled against the AMBAs, is like that the AMBAs actually are the ones that have attacked the schools to make sure that they have the lost generation, that they don't trust the government for these actions. So it's the AMBA boys that are actually doing this. But briefly going to my second point. Here in Washington, the Cameroonian government has retained the services of 3 high-profile lobbying firms, one of which is Squire Patton Boggs, which on the 1st of May was the target of a press conference by a group known as Save the Persecuted Christians. This group has also been retained by the Cameroonian government between July of 2018 and December of 2018. This group has received more than $250,000 from the Cameroonian government for advice and PR regarding advice on U.S. policy towards Africa and to assist in PR. Other groups, such as another group is Glover Point Group. They have a similar mission as well, to assist Cameroonian government with PR here in Washington, as well as Mercury Communications, which actually had the same message as well. So the Cameroonian government is hell-bent on having people. helping us have their point of view presented and nothing else is saying, we know what's going on in Cameroon, there's not really an issue here.
That's 7 minutes, unfortunately. Unless in later questions they can pursue that. We will now go to Mr. Tabara for 7 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And my first question will be to Ms. Agabahe. My question is what measures are being taken to control the spread of incitement and discrimination in Cameroon, and has there been any human rights activists that have really been pushing for to help spread this incitement and discrimination?
There are measures that have already been taken. There is a crisis going on, but the issue that is at the origin of the crisis goes back to the independence of Cameroon in 1960. There has been small measures like nominating someone from the Anglophone regions in the government. The one measure that generated the crisis that we have now is the fact that they were sending Francophone teachers to Anglophone regions instead of them being Anglophone. Is a culture. Is really hard to see what exactly the government is doing, because it's the culture and it's something that has been going on for more than 40 years now. So it's really hard to see what exactly the government is doing in the right way. I can give you a list of what they're doing wrong, but what they're doing in the right way is really hard to see, because they're not sending the right signals to the people in the Anglophone region. They were the president himself called them terrorists. He called them terrorists, and he called for the army to respond to that as they would do in the northern part of the country, for example. So it hasn't been yet a strong positive signal against discrimination. In Cameroon, regarding activists, so there are activists on specific issues. On these Anglophone regions, there is a lawyer. His name is Felix Agbo, who is one very vocal activist. He's a lawyer, so of course he knows the laws, but also he's from the region. He's based in those regions. He's still based there, despite of what's happening, and he's one vocal and strong voice in the country on this issue.
And in terms of the international community, they've asked for immediate end to the violence. What has been the role of the African Union in this? Have they played a significant role, and has there been any progress on ending the violence?
Not yet. We're still waiting to see. The only initiative that has happened for now was at the UN level, but it didn't come from the African Union. We have been trying to push for it, but it hasn't happened yet that it will come from the African Union.
And my next question would be to Mr. Scott Morgan. You mentioned that in your testimony that this can only be done through a dialogue. Has the dialogue within the past couple of years since the crisis has been increased, has there been more or less of a dialogue on an international stage, and has Cameroon complied with a lot of these dialogues?
Recently, calls for dialogue are a recent phenomenon. Briefings at the UN Security Council have been a good start, as well as forums as in both Ottawa and here in Washington. But the Cameroonian government says that we do not have a problem here. A lot of this is just propaganda, fake news, whatever, or this is an internal matter. That is a problem that needs to be addressed. But I have to agree with my co-participant. Both CMAC, the Commonwealth, and the AU have been too silent yet. I'm actually surprised that the court, the Peace and Security Commission of the AU has not taken this up yet. That could be another outlet for our friends at the AU as well, because they haven't addressed this yet either. And you would think that that would have occurred before this went to the UN Security Council.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll go to the next question from Ms. Hardcastle.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And my question will be for the both of you. I'll set it up, and then you can use the remainder of my time. I'll let you know. We'll split it up. So we can start with Ms. Agbahi, and then I'll let you know when that time is done. Okay, so I'm going to ask you about the Human Rights Commissioner's view that there is a window of opportunity for de-escalation of the conflict. Where you think we should be going. We heard that the Commonwealth nations, Cameroon is a member of the Commonwealth. Has anyone been vocal? Is there something Canada should be doing to follow suit, or should we be engaging that community specifically? And how can we basically de-escalate? Part of what we're doing here in hearing different testimony on the issue is to be able to make recommendations. And so the recommendations would have to be about what we think Canada's role should be. So thinking about that, how would you like to contribute? So we'll start with you, Madam.
Thank you. There's clearly a window for escalation of violence in Anglophone regions. As I was saying, all signals of red in the country. It has been really hard for us to work on this particular issue because there's basically it's hard for us to find a partner among international community, a strong voice among countries from the international community. What we usually tell the states is, whatever your partnership is with Cameroon, make sure human rights is one key condition for delivering that partnership. If for countries like the United States of America or Israel being a particular case, but the United States of America who provides arms and weapons to the Cameroonian army, we have been telling them make sure their arms are not used to torture people or are not involved in unlawful killing. In other countries, in West Africa, for example, where the aid was in support of education or health, make sure that the money goes exactly where it is supposed to go and it's not diverted into security. So it's basically tailored on what exactly is the content of the partnership Canada has with Cameroon, and then use human rights as a key condition for that partnership, either to exist or to continue.
Okay, Mr. Morgan.
For those remarks, but I would also go back to my point on the Peace and Security Council. One of Cameroon's immediate neighbors is on the Peace and Security Council of the AU for the next year. That is Nigeria, which also has a stake in this, not just with the Boko Haram issue and the repatriation of refugees. So what goes on in Cameroon, Nigeria has a stake in, because what we're seeing develop is some of the fault lines we're seeing in Nigeria are actually showing up in Cameroon as well. So basically, if we get Nigeria could be a country to focus on for Canada to do that, and not only reach out through the Commonwealth, but also suggest that they take it up at the Peace and Security Council of the AU. Other things I would suggest is maybe also having groups have programs similar to AID do specific programs, not only to deal with education, but also with healthcare. Because, we focus on education and refugees, but, we're seeing some of the victims, and, you wonder what type of healthcare that they're getting as well. So that could, reaching out to the International Red Cross and Red Crescent could be another avenue of our approach to see if we could get their views as well.
Thank you very, very much. I want to thank both of our witnesses, Scott Morgan and Titi Agbahe. And I'd also like to remind the committee that we have our special session on Monday from 10:15 to 11:15 a.m. with Michelle Bachelet, who, as we all know, is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. So hope that our others will tune in as well on Monday. And with that, Question by Ms. Hardcastle.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Chair. I just have a point of order. I would like to submit a submission of testimony, written testimony from our study that we had on Iran accountability for someone who wasn't able to be at the committee. That was Dr. Parsi. And I have the English and the French translation of a written submission that I'd like to submit to the committee.
Okay, that wouldn't be a point of order at this point. I would like to dismiss the witnesses, but certainly that's something that we could discuss in the steering committee. But I do understand that has been dealt with by the committee already. But we can discuss further. But it's not a point of order at the moment. So I would like to thank everybody, and we'll come back on Monday. Thank you.